Who is the James mentioned in Acts 12:17? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Acts chapter 12, verses 11 and 19. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Acts chapter 12, verse 11. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Acts chapter 12, beginning at verse 11. And when Peter had come to himself, he said, "Now I know for certain that the Lord has sent his angel and delivered me from the hand of Herod and from all the expectation of the Jewish people." So when he had considered this, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together, praying. And as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a girl named Rhoda came to answer. When she recognized Peter's voice, because of her gladness, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter stood before the gate. But they said to her, "You are beside yourself." Yet she kept insisting that it was so. So they said, "It is an angel. It is his angel." Now Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. But motioning to them with his hand to keep silent, he declared to them how the Lord had brought him out of prison. And he said, "Go tell these things to James and to the brethren." And he departed and went to another place. Then as soon as it was day, there was no small stir among the soldiers about what had become of Peter. But when Herod had searched for him and not found him, he examined the guards and commanded that they should be put to death. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea and stayed there. In the last lesson, we saw the harassment of the church led by Herod Agrippa I. He had the support of the Jewish religious elite who had been against the teachings of Jesus for more than a decade by now. James, the brother of John, an apostle of Jesus Christ that we met back in the Gospels, was executed. Peter would have been executed too had it not been for it being Passover time. Herod thus had Peter imprisoned until the feast was over, after which the plan was for him to be executed. In the meantime, though, the church was continually praying for the safety of Peter. So continuous was their prayer that some were still praying in verse 12. Today, people do not believe in the power of prayer. Some believe that God already knows what we need or has already decided what to do, so what's the point of praying? Some don't believe in God at all, so obviously don't believe in prayer. But to the Christian who follows the Bible, not only do we believe in the power of prayer, we can see the evidence in our lives of God answering those prayers. Now, sometimes God doesn't give us the answer we want, as what we pray for didn't come to pass. But that doesn't mean that our prayers somehow didn't work. It just wasn't God's will at that particular moment. However, since we don't know the individual will for God in our lives apart from serving Him faithfully, we need to be persistent in prayer. Jesus taught persistence in prayer in Luke 18:1-8. Jesus also taught us to be thankful when we pray for the things God has already done for us. And the apostles taught us later in the epistles that we need to have faith when we pray, trusting that God is able to do what we ask for in faith, according to His will. God is not our genie, giving us our every desire, but He is our Father in heaven who has promised to provide for us, as Christians, what we need according to His will. That phrase, according to His will, is important, though, for sometimes it isn't the will of God to do something, or it isn't His will at that time. We have to accept that and not get discouraged, for God knows best. The church at Jerusalem didn't know if God would release Peter from prison, or if Peter would be killed like James was. But they knew God had the power to release Peter, and so they prayed. And at this particular time, it was God's will to release Peter, and so He sent an angel to do just that. Now, Peter was asleep before the angel came to release him, so at first Peter didn't know if what was happening was a vision or actually happening. However, once in the city, verse 11 says that Peter had now determined that the Lord had in fact sent an angel to release him from Herod's hand and from the hands of the Jews. Where would he go now? Well, he went to where he knew the disciples would be, at the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark. We will meet this Mark later on in Acts, but this is the Mark who would later write the Gospel of Mark. Even though it was after dark and most of the city was asleep, not so at Mary's house. The disciples were there praying. When Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a girl named Rhoda came to answer. Now, of course, it was dark, so she couldn't see Peter, but she did recognize his voice. Excited, she forgot to let him in, instead running to tell the others that Peter was standing at the gate. Now, the disciples thought she was crazy, but when she insisted, they then discounted it as his angel. Now, this is a passage where people get the idea of guardian angels, but we don't read in scriptures of an angel being assigned to guard individual Christians, for as we know, Christians are martyred for the cause of Christ. What their exact meaning here is obscure, but it could simply mean that they were referring to an angel sent by God to report on Peter's condition. While all this discussion is going on, though, Peter is still standing at the gate. Finally, the group came to the door and were astonished at what they saw. Peter, though, didn't want them to wake the city, and so he told them how the Lord released him from prison, and that they were to go and tell James and the brethren in Jerusalem this message. Peter then left to an undisclosed location, and we won't see him again until chapter 15. The question, though, is, who is this James? Well, it's not James, the son of Zebedee, for he was killed at the beginning of the chapter. It theoretically could have been James the Less, the second apostle with the name James. However, the more likely answer is that it is James, the Lord's brother. We met this man by name only in Matthew 13:55. We know from Acts 1 that the Lord's brothers did become believers in Jesus following the resurrection. We will meet this James twice more in Acts, namely in Acts 15 and 21. But it is really the Apostle Paul in Galatians 1 and 2 that cements in my mind that James, the Lord's brother, is being talked about here. When we get to Galatians, we're going to find that this James held a place of influence in the Jerusalem church and was likely one of its elders. Even in Acts 15 we see this, though there, which James we're talking about, is not directly known. With all that in mind, I believe it is safe to conclude that this James is James, the Lord's brother, that Peter directs the disciples at Mary's house to inform of his release, who in turn would inform the rest of the church. Does it matter which James this was? Not really, but it is something that is interesting and useful to discuss, since Luke mentions it. Meanwhile, the next day there was a great stir among the soldiers as to what had happened to Peter. Herod searched for Peter but didn't find him. He interrogated the guards but didn't gain any information as to what happened, so he sentenced them to death. With nothing left to do, he went down from Jerusalem in Judea and came to Caesarea on the coast, which is where we will find him, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Acts chapter 12, verses 20 to 25, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.